At 24, Amara Williams has been counting every dollar and every hour for 8 months, balancing 3 jobs and her mother's mounting medical bills with the desperate precision of someone who knows that one mistake means losing everything. But tonight, at the most exclusive charity gala in the city, her carefully constructed survival plan is about to crumble in the most unexpected way. Amara adjusted the black serving apron around her waist for the 3rd time, checking her reflection in the polished steel of the industrial kitchen. Her natural hair was swept back in an elegant twist that took 20 minutes she didn't have this morning, and her makeup covered the exhaustion that had become her permanent companion. At 24, she should have been finishing her art history degree, maybe working at a gallery, building the life she'd dreamed about since high school. Instead, she was here, balancing the worn-out serving trays of metropolitan catering with the relentless demands of her other 2 jobs and her mother's insulin regimen. She was practical, focused, and knew the value of every single dollar that passed through her hands. Her dark skin seemed to glow even under the harsh kitchen lighting, and her brown eyes held a determined intensity that made her supervisors trust her with the most demanding clients. Tonight's event was the annual Heritage Foundation Gala, the kind of charity auction where single donations exceeded her entire yearly income. She'd volunteered for the overtime because the pay differential could cover another week of her mother's medication. Amara pressed her fingers against her temples, fighting the dull headache that had been building since lunch. Actually, since the coffee and granola bar that had served as lunch, and breakfast, and yesterday's dinner. The math was simple and brutal. Every dollar spent on food was a dollar not going toward the medical bills that grew faster than she could pay them. Her mother's diabetes had worsened significantly over the past 6 months, requiring specialized care and medications that insurance covered only partially. The remainder fell to Amara, who had quietly dropped out of school and picked up a 3rd job without telling anyone the full extent of their financial crisis. The ballroom beyond the kitchen doors was a monument to wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in silk, where guests in designer gowns and custom suits sipped champagne that cost more than Amara made in a week. She'd worked enough events like this to recognize the markers, the subtle but unmistakable signs of serious money. Original artwork on the walls, servers who moved with military precision, security personnel who looked more like private military contractors than hotel staff. As Amara moved through the crowd with her tray of champagne flutes, she noticed him immediately. Table 7, sitting alone despite the couples and groups surrounding him. A Korean man in his mid to late 30s, wearing a suit that belonged in a different category entirely from everyone else's expensive clothing. The fabric was so dark it seemed to absorb light, and the cut was so precise it looked architectural rather than tailored. His presence was different too, a singular weight that made the air around him feel heavier, more charged. He had sharp, almost sculpted features, dark hair swept back with military precision, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without revealing anything. When those eyes found hers across the room, Amara felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. He was studying her face with an intensity that made her pause mid-step, nearly losing her grip on the tray. There was something about the way he watched her that felt different from the usual wealthy patron observation. He wasn't looking through her the way most guests did, treating servers as invisible furniture. Instead, he seemed to be seeing something specific, noting details with the same careful attention he might give to appraising a valuable piece of art. Amara forced herself to look away and continue serving, but she could feel his gaze following her as she moved between tables. When she finally approached table 7, her heart was beating faster than the simple act of walking warranted. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked, her voice steady despite the strange nervousness his attention created. "Champagne is fine," he replied. His English was perfect, with only the faintest accent that made his words sound more deliberate, more considered than casual conversation. "Are you feeling well?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm sorry. You look tired," he said quietly, those dark eyes taking in details she thought she'd hidden well. "When did you last eat?" The directness of the question flustered her. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, the response so practiced it came out without thought. "Just a busy evening." He continued watching her with that unsettling focus. She could feel him cataloging the slight tremor in her hands, the way she'd been blinking more frequently, the careful way she moved, as if conserving energy. His scrutiny felt both invasive and oddly protective, like he was looking for something specific and finding more than he'd expected. Amara finished serving his table and moved away, but the strange encounter stayed with her as she continued working. Several times she caught him watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable but attentive. It wasn't threatening, exactly, but it wasn't casual interest either. There was purpose behind his observation, though she couldn't begin to guess what it might be. As the evening progressed, the combination of exhaustion, stress, and her inadequate diet began taking a more serious toll. The headache that had been manageable became a sharp, persistent pain behind her eyes. Her vision started developing small dark spots around the edges, and the ballroom's warmth felt oppressive despite the air conditioning. She'd experienced low blood sugar episodes before, but never while working, never in public. The tray in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The crystal glasses seemed to multiply before her eyes, their edges becoming soft and unfocused. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, a rapid, irregular rhythm that reminded her too much of her mother's complications during her last hospital stay. The world tilted sideways without warning. Amara felt herself falling, the tray of champagne flutes seeming to float away from her hands in slow motion. The ballroom's elegant chatter became distant, muffled, as if she were hearing it from underwater. The last thing she registered was the sound of expensive crystal shattering against marble, and then strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. The scent that surrounded her as consciousness faded was expensive cologne, something woodsy and sophisticated that spoke of serious money and serious power. She heard a voice speaking rapid Korean, commanding and authoritative, giving orders that were immediately obeyed. The voice was familiar, though her disoriented mind couldn't quite place it until everything went dark. The last word she heard before losing consciousness completely was spoken in English, quiet but unmistakably possessive, breathed against her hair as those strong arms lifted her. Mine. Ready to continue to Chapter 2? Please let me know when you'd like me to proceed with Chapter 2, Waking in His Arms. Amara's consciousness returned slowly, like surfacing from deep water, her awareness rebuilding itself in careful layers. First came the realization that she was lying down somewhere soft and expensive, far different from her own threadbare sheets. Then the scent, cedar and leather, with an undertone of something crisp and masculine that definitely wasn't the industrial disinfectant of a hospital. Finally, the silence, which was wrong in every possible way because hospitals were never this quiet. She opened her eyes to find herself in a room that belonged in an architectural magazine rather than any medical facility she'd ever seen. The walls were a warm charcoal gray, decorated with what looked like original artwork, and the bed she lay in was easily twice the size of her entire bedroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed a view of the city that could only come from serious height and serious money, the kind of penthouse perspective that most people only saw in movies. And 4-line ran from her left arm to a medical stand beside the bed, the clear fluid dripping with the steady precision of professional equipment. She was wearing different clothes, a soft cotton nightgown that fit perfectly and probably cost more than her monthly rent. Someone had removed her makeup, braided her hair, and taken care to ensure she was comfortable in ways that spoke of genuine concern rather than mere efficiency. "You're awake," said a familiar voice from across the room. Amara turned her head to find the man from Table 7 sitting in a leather chair near the windows, still wearing that impossibly perfect suit though he'd removed the jacket and rolled up his sleeves. In the soft lamplight, his features were even sharper than she'd remembered, all precise angles and controlled intensity. His dark eyes held the same careful attention that had unnerved her at the gala, but now there was something else there, a satisfaction that suggested he was pleased to see her conscious and alert. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice rougher than expected. "My home," he replied simply. "You collapsed at the Metropolitan Ballroom. I brought you here rather than a hospital because I thought you might prefer privacy." The casual way he said it, as if bringing unconscious strangers to his penthouse was perfectly normal behavior, sent warning signals through her exhausted mind. She struggled to sit up, immediately feeling dizzy, and found his hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly keeping her in place. The 4 needs to finish, he said. You were severely dehydrated and your blood sugar was dangerously low. When did you last have a proper meal? I'm fine, Amara said automatically, the lie so practiced it required no thought. I need to go home. My mother will be worried. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition that suggested he knew exactly how substantial that lie was. Your mother is diabetic, he said. It wasn't a question. The medical bills are why you're working 3 jobs and forgetting to eat. The accuracy of his assessment hit her like cold water. How do you know that? She asked, her voice sharper now, defensive. I pay attention, he replied. Tonight wasn't the first time I've seen you working events in the city. You've lost weight over the past few months. Your shoes are resold, but expensive, which means you dress well when you can afford to, but you're making careful choices about where to spend money. You work with the efficiency of someone who can't afford to make mistakes. And when you collapsed, the first thing you said when the paramedic asked about emergency contacts was your mother's name and diabetes medication schedule. Amara stared at him, processing the implications of his observation. He'd been watching her long enough to notice changes in her appearance, which meant this wasn't chance or coincidence. The realization should have frightened her more than it did, but she was too tired and too grateful for the 4 fluids to properly manage alarm. Who are you? She asked. Kong Miho, he said. I'm 36 years old, and I solve problems for people who can afford my services. The way he said it, the careful neutrality of his phrasing, told her everything and nothing. Problem-solving for wealthy clients could mean anything from corporate consulting to activities that operated in much grayer areas. Given the expensive anonymity of his penthouse, the quality of the medical equipment, and the casual way he'd taken charge of a stranger's medical emergency, she suspected his services fell into the more complicated category. Why did you bring me here instead of a hospital? She asked. Because hospital bills would have created another problem you can't afford to solve, he said simply. And because I wanted to talk to you privately. Amara felt her heart rate increase. Though whether from fear or something else, she wasn't entirely sure. About what? Your situation, Miho said. He stood and moved closer to the bed, his presence somehow both comforting and intimidating. You're drowning, Amara Williams. Working yourself to exhaustion, sacrificing your health, your education, your future, trying to keep your mother alive. How much longer do you think you can maintain this pace? The directness of his assessment, the way he cut straight through her carefully maintained pretense that everything was manageable, made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She'd spent so many months projecting strength, convincing everyone, including herself, that she could handle the mounting pressure, that having someone see through the facade felt both terrifying and oddly relieving. I'm handling it, she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her. You collapsed serving champagne because you haven't eaten in 2 days, Miho said quietly. That's not handling it. That's slowly dying while pretending everything is under control. The accuracy of his observation hit too close to home. Amara felt tears threatening and forced them back, unwilling to break down in front of this stranger who seemed to see far too much. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miho returned to his chair, giving her space while maintaining that unsettling eye contact. I want to offer you a solution, he said. But first, I need you to understand something. I'm not a good man, Amara. I operate in spaces that exist between legal and illegal, and I solve problems using methods that most people would find questionable at best. However, I have resources, and I have an appreciation for people who sacrifice themselves for others. What you're doing for your mother, the way you work, your integrity in impossible circumstances, that's rare. Amara studied his face, trying to read between the lines of what he was saying. There was something almost gentle in his expression, despite the sharp features and controlled intensity. Whatever he was, whoever he was, she didn't think he meant her harm. The question was what he did mean. I don't understand, she said. You will, Miho replied. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a simple business card, placing it on the bedside table within her reach. When you're ready to stop handling everything alone, call me. When you're ready to accept that some problems require solutions you can't provide yourself, call me. When you're ready to put your mother's life above your pride, call me. Amara looked at the card. It was expensive cardstock with minimal information, just a name and phone number in elegant script. No company, no title, nothing that indicated what kind of services he actually provided. What kind of solution? She asked. The kind that solves your problem permanently, he said. The kind that ensures your mother gets the care she needs, and you get the life you deserve. The kind that comes with obligations, but obligations to someone who values what you bring rather than someone who simply uses what you're willing to sacrifice. The bag was nearly empty, the last of the fluids dripping slowly into her system. Amara could feel her strength returning, her thinking becoming clearer, but with clarity came the full weight of her situation. He was right about everything. She was drowning. She was slowly destroying herself, trying to solve an unsolvable problem. And this stranger, this dangerous man with his expensive penthouse and his careful observation, was offering her a lifeline she couldn't yet understand. I should go home, she said. You should, Miho agreed. He stood and moved to remove the line with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. I'll have my driver take you. But Amara, he paused, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. When you realize that pride is a luxury you can no longer afford, remember that some opportunities don't come twice. As he helped her to her feet, his hands careful and respectful, Amara caught his scent again, that expensive cologne that had been the last thing she'd smelled before losing consciousness. Standing this close to him, feeling the controlled strength in his touch, she was reminded of just how powerful his presence was. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to having his will become reality, and yet he was treating her with a gentleness that felt both surprising and dangerously appealing. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Miho replied, his voice low and oddly intimate. Save your gratitude for when you understand what I'm actually offering. As his driver escorted her to a car that probably cost more than most people's houses, Amara slipped the business card into her pocket, feeling its substantial weight against her fingers. She didn't understand what had just happened, didn't know what kind of solution he was proposing, but she knew with absolute certainty that Kong Miho would be the most dangerous decision she'd ever considered making. And she was already considering making it. Ready to continue to Chapter 3? Please let me know when you'd like me to proceed with Chapter 3, The Proposition. 2 weeks after the gala, Amara's carefully constructed world finally collapsed completely. Her mother's diabetes had spiraled into diabetic ketoacidosis, requiring emergency hospitalization and intensive care that insurance would cover only partially. The bills were already approaching $15,000, with more accumulating daily. Meanwhile, their landlord had delivered an eviction notice, tired of partial rent payments and empty promises about catching up next month. Amara sat in the hospital waiting room at 3 a.m, staring at the business card she'd carried in her wallet since that night. Kong Miho. The elegant script seemed to mock her pride, her determination to handle everything alone, her stubborn insistence that accepting help from a dangerous stranger was worse than watching her mother die slowly from inadequate care. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from creditors, from her various employers asking why she'd missed shifts, and 1 voice message from her landlord's lawyer discussing the eviction timeline. The mathematics were simple and brutal. She was drowning, exactly as Miho had said, and pride was indeed a luxury she could no longer afford. With shaking fingers, she dialed the number on the card. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert and unsurprised despite the hour. Amara, how did you know it was me? She asked. I've been expecting your call, Miho said simply. Where are you? 20 minutes later, a sleek black sedan arrived at the hospital entrance, driven by a man who looked more like private security than a typical chauffeur. Amara slipped into the leather interior, trying not to think about how the car's interior probably cost more than her mother's monthly medication budget. The drive took her through parts of the city she'd never seen, past buildings that spoke of serious money and serious privacy. When they finally stopped, it was in front of a converted warehouse in an area that managed to be both industrial and exclusive, the kind of neighborhood where businesses operated without obvious signage and visitors were expected by appointment only. Miho met her at a private elevator, still wearing that expensive suit despite the late hour, still radiating that controlled intensity that made the air around him feel charged. He looked exactly as composed as he had at the gala. While she was acutely aware of her hospital waiting room appearance, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. The elevator opened directly into his office, a space that managed to be both intimidating and beautiful. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture that looked custom-made, and artwork that she recognized as original pieces worth more than most people's houses. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spread below, a reminder of exactly how high above ordinary concerns this conversation was taking place. "Sit," Miho said, gesturing to a chair positioned across from his desk. The desk itself was a work of art, massive and clearly expensive, its surface holding only a few carefully arranged items: a laptop, a crystal paperweight, and a leather folder that he opened with deliberate precision. "Your mother's condition has deteriorated," he said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know that?" Amara asked. "I make it my business to know things that matter to me," Miho replied. His dark eyes held hers with that unsettling directness. "Diabetic ketoacidosis. Intensive care. The bills are already beyond your ability to pay, and they're increasing daily. Your landlord has initiated eviction proceedings. You've missed shifts at 2 of your jobs. Your credit cards are at their limits. Should I continue?" The accuracy of his information should have frightened her more than it did, but she was too exhausted and too desperate to properly process the implications of his surveillance. "No," she said quietly. "Good," Miho said. He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something more formal, more businesslike. "Then let's discuss the solution I mentioned." He opened the leather folder and withdrew several documents, arranging them on the desk with the precision of someone conducting serious negotiations. The papers looked official, complex, the kind of contracts that involved serious money and serious obligations. "I'm prepared to offer you a position," Miho said. "Personal art consultant and cultural liaison for my legitimate business operations. The salary is $200,000 annually, paid monthly, with a signing bonus of $50,000 available immediately." Amara felt her breath catch. The numbers he was quoting represented more money than she'd ever imagined having, more than enough to solve every financial problem that had been destroying her life for the past year. "Your mother's medical care would be covered completely," Miho continued. "Private physicians, the best specialists available, experimental treatments if necessary. I would also provide appropriate housing for both of you, a secured apartment in one of my buildings, furnished and maintained at my expense." The offer was so far beyond what she dared hope for that she felt dizzy. But there had to be conditions, obligations that would justify this level of generosity from a man who'd made it clear he wasn't particularly good. "What would you expect in exchange?" she asked. Miho's expression remained neutral, but she caught a flicker of something that might have been approval. "Absolute loyalty," he said. "Complete discretion about my business activities and personal life. You would live in my secured compound rather than the separate apartment I mentioned, for your safety and my peace of mind. You would accompany me to business and social functions as needed. And you would understand that once you accept these terms, leaving would not be a simple matter of giving notice." The last condition sent warning signals through her exhausted mind. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that you would become part of my world," Miho said. "You would have access to information and resources that require protection. You would be under my protection, which is not something I offer lightly or withdraw casually. It means that your well-being would become my responsibility, and my responsibilities are permanent." Amara studied his face, trying to read between the lines of what he was saying. The formal language couldn't quite disguise the possessiveness underlying his offer, the sense that he was proposing something more complex than a simple business arrangement. "You're asking me to sign my life over to you," she said. "I'm asking you to accept salvation instead of pride," Miho replied. "I'm asking you to choose your mother's life over your independence. I'm asking you to trust that I value what you offer more than most people value anything." "And if I change my mind?" she asked. "If I decide I want to leave?" Miho's expression hardened slightly, his voice taking on an edge that reminded her exactly how dangerous he was. "Then you would discover that my protection comes with obligations that don't end simply because you become ungrateful or restless." "But Amara," he leaned forward, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I don't think you'll want to leave. I think you'll find that being valued, being protected, being able to save the person you love most, is worth more than the abstract concept of independence that's currently killing you both." Amara stared at the documents on his desk, her mind spinning through the implications of what he was proposing. The money would solve everything immediately. Her mother would receive the best care available. She would never again have to choose between rent and medication, between food and utilities, between her future and her family's survival. But she would belong to him. That's what he was really saying, underneath all the formal language about employment and loyalty. She would become his, permanently and completely, in ways that probably extended far beyond professional obligations. "This isn't really a job offer," she said quietly. "No," Miho agreed. "It's an invitation to let me solve your problems permanently, in exchange for becoming mine." The honesty of his answer, the way he stripped away the pretense and stated his intentions clearly, was both terrifying and oddly comforting. At least he wasn't lying to her about what he wanted. Amara closed her eyes, thinking about her mother lying in that hospital bed, about the eviction notice in her purse, about the crushing weight of trying to save someone she loved while slowly destroying herself in the process. When she opened them again, Miho was watching her with an expression of patient certainty, as if he already knew what her decision would be. "You're not giving me a choice," she said. "I'm giving you the only choice that matters," Miho replied. "Your mother's life, or your pride, your future, or your independence, salvation or dignity. Choose." Amara looked at the papers again, at the dollar amounts that represented the difference between life and death, between hope and despair. She thought about the months of exhaustion, the constant fear, the slow realization that her determination wasn't enough to solve problems that required resources she would never possess. Maybe morality was a luxury she couldn't afford. Maybe independence was a privilege for people who weren't watching their loved ones die slowly from inadequate care. Maybe accepting help from a dangerous man was better than the pride that was killing them both. She reached for the pen he'd placed beside the documents. "I understand the terms, Mr. Kong," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. Miho's smile was small but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd successfully acquired something valuable. "Welcome to my world, Amara," he said. "You won't regret this decision." As she signed her name to papers that would change everything, Amara wondered if he was right. She hoped he was right, because there was no going back now, and the man sitting across from her had just become the most important person in her life, whether that was salvation or something far more complicated. Either way, it was done. She belonged to Kong Miho now, and despite everything, that felt less terrifying than it should have. Ready to continue to Chapter 4? Please let me know when you'd like me to proceed with Chapter 4, Integration and Revelation. 3 months after signing those papers, Amara's life had been transformed so completely that her previous existence felt like something that had happened to someone else entirely. Her mother was thriving under the care of private physicians who treated diabetes like a manageable inconvenience rather than a death sentence. The medical team Miho had assembled included specialists who were developing a personalized treatment plan that had already improved her mother's condition beyond anything the overworked hospital staff had achieved. Amara woke each morning in a bedroom larger than her former apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens that were maintained by a staff she rarely saw, but whose work created an oasis of beauty in the middle of the city. The compound itself was a masterpiece of architecture and security, looking more like a private estate than the fortress it actually was. High walls surrounded acres of manicured grounds, while discreet security measures ensured that the piece Amara had found here was protected by methods she preferred not to examine too closely. Her work as Miho's art consultant had proven surprisingly fulfilling. His legitimate businesses included several galleries, an auction house, and cultural exchange programs that required someone with both artistic knowledge and cultural sensitivity. Amara discovered that her abandoned art history studies provided exactly the expertise he needed, while his resources allowed her to pursue research and acquisitions on a scale she'd never imagined possible. Today she stood in his private office, reviewing acquisition proposals for a collection of contemporary Korean artists that would anchor a new gallery opening. The afternoon light through his windows cast warm shadows across the documents spread between them, and she was acutely aware of his presence as he reviewed her recommendations with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered to him. "You've included Park Minjun's early work," Miho observed, his finger tracing a line in her proposal. His voice held approval. Most consultants focus on his recent pieces, but you're right that the progression from his traditional training shows more clearly in the earlier paintings. Amara looked up from her notes to find him watching her with that intensity that still made her pulse quicken, despite 3 months of growing familiarity. His suit today was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored as always, but she'd begun to notice smaller details. The way he unconsciously adjusted his cufflinks when he was thinking, the slight softening around his eyes when he was pleased with something she'd said. You understand the cultural context in ways that most Western experts miss, he continued. It's why your recommendations are valuable. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Working with Miho had revealed intellectual depths she hadn't expected, a genuine appreciation for art and culture that went beyond simple acquisition of expensive objects. Their professional conversations had gradually expanded into discussions about aesthetics, history, and philosophy that left her feeling more intellectually stimulated than she'd been since leaving school. These evening conversations had become routine, usually over dinner in his private dining room, while they discussed the day's work and planned future projects. Tonight was no different, except that Amara found herself paying more attention to the way the lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, the controlled grace of his movements as he poured wine, the unexpected domesticity of sharing meals with someone who commanded fear and respect throughout the city. You seem different tonight, she said, noting a tension in his posture that hadn't been there during their earlier meeting. Miho paused, his wine glass halfway to his lips. Different how? Quieter, more thoughtful than usual. Amara hesitated, then decided that 3 months of living under his protection had earned her the right to express concern. Is everything all right? He set down his glass and studied her face for a long moment, as if deciding whether to answer honestly or deflect with the polite evasions he used with everyone else. Today marks 5 years since my sister died, he said finally. The simple statement carried weight that made Amara's chest tighten. She'd wondered about his family, about the experiences that had shaped him into someone who wielded power with such careful control, but he'd never volunteered personal information beyond what was necessary for their working relationship. I'm sorry, she said quietly. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Miho stood and moved to the windows, his silhouette outlined against the city lights below. She was 23, he said. Sweet, kind, everything good in a world that's mostly dark. She met a man who seemed charming, successful, the kind of person our family would approve of. For months, everything appeared perfect. Amara remained silent, sensing that this revelation was important in ways that extended far beyond simple biography. By the time we realized what was really happening, it was too late, Miho continued. The charm was manipulation. The success was built on fraud and violence. He isolated her from family, from friends, made her dependent on him financially and emotionally. When she finally tried to leave, he killed her rather than let her go. The quiet devastation in his voice made Amara's throat tighten. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched slightly as he spoke. I was building my empire then, Miho said, too focused on power and money and establishing my position to notice that someone I loved needed help. I had resources, connections, the ability to solve problems that seemed impossible, but I was too blind to see that the most important problem was happening right in front of me. By the time I understood what he was doing to her, she was already gone. Amara rose and moved to stand beside him at the windows, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd him. The view showed the city spread below them, millions of lights representing lives he could influence with a phone call, power that had come too late to save the person who mattered most. That's why you noticed me at the gala, she said, understanding flooding through her. Why you saw what others missed. Miho turned to look at her, his dark eyes holding pain and recognition. You reminded me of her, he said. Not physically, but the way you carried yourself despite being exhausted. The way you kept working, kept trying to solve an impossible problem through sheer determination. The way you put someone else's well-being above your own survival. The parallel between her situation and his sister's struck her with unexpected force. Both women struggling alone, both trying to protect themselves or others from forces beyond their control, both needing help they were too proud or too afraid to ask for. You couldn't save her, Amara said softly. But you could save me. Miho's expression shifted, vulnerability replacing the controlled mask he wore with everyone else. I told myself I was just protecting you, just keeping you safe because I failed her, he said. But that's not entirely true. I'm keeping you here because I'm selfish. Because you make this dark world bearable. Because when I come home and you're here, working on something that matters to you, excited about a new discovery or frustrated with a difficult authentication, I remember that there's more to life than power and revenge. The honesty of his confession, the way he stripped away his careful control to show her the man beneath the dangerous exterior, made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. Amara found herself stepping closer, drawn by an impulse she couldn't entirely analyze. You're not selfish for wanting to protect people, she said. And you're not a monster for the methods you use to do it. Miho's hand reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing along her cheek with surprising gentleness. You see me differently than most people do, he said. I see someone who builds galleries and supports artists and ensures that women like me don't have to choose between pride and survival, Amara replied. I see someone who turned his guilt into purpose, his loss into protection for others. The space between them seemed to vibrate with possibility, with the recognition that their relationship had shifted into territory neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. Amara was acutely aware of his touch, of the warmth radiating from his skin, of the way his usual control seemed to be fraying around the edges. You make me want to be better than what I am, Miho said, his voice low and rough with emotion. You already are better than what you think you are, Amara replied. The distance between them disappeared as he leaned down to rest his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the space that had become charged with 3 months of growing attraction and tonight's emotional revelation. Amara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the way her body responded to his proximity with an intensity that should have alarmed her. Instead of fear, she felt safety. Instead of uncertainty, she felt rightness. This dangerous man who had saved her mother's life, who valued her mind and protected her future, who trusted her enough to share his deepest regrets, had become something far more complex than the arrangement they'd originally negotiated. When he whispered her name against her lips, barely a breath of sound, Amara realized that somewhere between gratitude and comfort, between professional respect and personal protection, she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Kong Miho. The recognition should have terrified her. Instead, as she reached up to touch the face of the man who had rebuilt her world, she felt only the quiet certainty that this dangerous, complicated, surprisingly tender man had become hers just as completely as she had become his. Tomorrow, she would worry about the implications of loving someone whose protection came with permanence she couldn't escape. Tonight, she simply allowed herself to accept that the best decision she'd ever made was trusting him with everything that mattered to her. Ready to continue to Chapter 5? Please let me know when you'd like me to proceed with Chapter 5, Threat and Protection. The first warning came in the form of a white sedan that appeared in Amara's peripheral vision too often to be coincidence. 3 days running, she noticed the same vehicle maintaining distance as she traveled between the compound, her mother's medical appointments, and the gallery spaces she managed for Miho's expanding cultural enterprises. When she mentioned it during their evening dinner, his expression hardened in a way that reminded her exactly how dangerous her new world could be. That night, security around the compound tripled. Men who looked more like military operatives than private guards began patrolling the grounds with equipment that definitely wasn't standard for civilian protection. Miho's explanations were minimal but direct. A rival organization had taken interest in his operations, and by extension, had taken interest in her. The second warning was more personal. Amara arrived at her mother's specialist appointment to find that someone had accessed her medical files, claiming to be conducting an insurance review that the actual insurance company had no record of authorizing. The breach itself was troubling enough, but the obvious message behind it was worse. They knew exactly who mattered to Amara, and they could reach those people whenever they chose. I can increase security for your mother, Miho said when she reported the incident. Private guards, secure transport, relocation to a facility within my compound if necessary. She's finally stable and comfortable with her current doctors, Amara replied. I won't disrupt her life because of vague threats. These aren't vague threats, Miho said, his voice carrying an edge that reminded her why other people feared him. These are calculated pressure tactics designed to establish vulnerability before direct action. They're testing our responses, mapping our defensive priorities. But Amara had spent too many months maintaining independence to easily accept expanded restrictions, even sensible ones. She'd worked too hard to create a life where her mother received excellent care in a familiar environment to surrender that progress to unnamed dangers that might never materialize into actual violence. The third warning shattered her illusions about managing the situation through careful routine and reasonable precautions. Amara was leaving the medical center after her mother's weekly appointment when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single photograph, her mother sleeping in her hospital bed, taken from inside her supposedly secure private room. Below the image, a simple message: "She looks peaceful. It would be unfortunate if something disturbed her rest." Her blood turned cold as the implications hit her. They had been inside her mother's room. They had been close enough to touch her, to harm her, to take her. All of Amara's careful independence, her refusal to accept additional security, her determination to maintain normal routines, had accomplished nothing except to prove exactly how vulnerable they both were. Amara's hands shook as she called Miho, her voice unsteady when he answered immediately. They were in her room, she said without preamble. They photographed her sleeping. "Where are you now?" Miho asked, his voice shifting into the tone of controlled authority she'd learned to associate with genuine danger. "Parking garage, level 3, section C. I'm going back inside to check on her." "No," Miho said sharply. "Get to your car immediately and leave. Do not go back inside. Do not stop anywhere. Come straight home." "But my mother will be protected starting now," Miho interrupted. "I'm sending security to her room immediately. Your job is to get to safety before they decide to escalate from threats to action." Amara ended the call and moved quickly toward her car, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and guilt. She should have listened to his warnings. She should have accepted that her stubborn independence was putting the people she loved in danger. She should have understood that some threats required responses she couldn't provide herself. The parking garage was nearly empty this late in the evening, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars. Her footsteps echoed in the enclosed space as she hurried toward her car, keys already in hand. The familiar routine of leaving after her mother's appointment had never felt sinister before, but now every shadow seemed to hold potential danger. She was 5 feet from her car when 3 men stepped out from behind a van, their positions clearly coordinated to block any escape route. They weren't making any attempt to appear casual or accidental. This was a deliberate interception, planned and executed with military precision. "Amara Williams," the centerman said, her name spoken with casual familiarity that made her skin crawl. "You're going to come with us quietly, or your mother's next medical emergency will be permanent." Her breath caught as adrenaline flooded her system, her mind racing through options that all led to the same conclusion. She was completely alone, completely outmatched, and completely out of reasonable alternatives. These weren't opportunistic criminals making random threats. These were professionals who had studied her routines, identified her vulnerabilities, and chosen this moment specifically because it offered them maximum control. "I don't know what you want," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the terror coursing through her veins. "We want your cooperation," the man replied. "Mr. Kong has something that belongs to us. You're going to help us negotiate its return." The casual way he referenced Miho, the assumption that she would serve as leverage against someone whose protection she'd taken for granted, made her understand with crystal clarity exactly how naive her resistance to additional security had been. She wasn't just Kong Miho's art consultant. She was his weakness, the person whose safety mattered enough to him that threatening her would force his hand. The men began moving closer, their approach unhurried but purposeful. Amara backed against her car, calculating distances and recognizing that running was pointless. They had chosen this location specifically because it offered no escape routes, no witnesses, no possibility of outside intervention. Then the elevator doors opened with a soft chime that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Miho stepped out flanked by 2 men who moved with the same controlled efficiency that marked all of his security personnel. His suit was immaculate as always, but there was something different in his posture, a predatory stillness that reminded her why people spoke his name with fear. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the parking garage with absolute authority. "You seem to be having a conversation with something that belongs to me." The three men immediately shifted position, hands moving toward weapons they hadn't bothered to display while facing an unarmed woman alone. But Miho's security had already anticipated the movement, their own weapons appearing with practiced speed that spoke of extensive training and frequent use. "Mr. Kong," the leader said, his earlier confidence wavering slightly. "We were hoping to arrange a meeting to discuss mutual interests." Miho moved closer with deliberate steps, his dark eyes never leaving the men who had threatened Amara. "My interests are very simple," he said. "The woman behind you is under my protection. Threatening her is the same as threatening me directly, and I respond to threats with permanent solutions." The temperature in the parking garage seemed to drop several degrees. Amara could feel the shift in atmosphere, the way violence became a tangible possibility hanging in the air between the two groups. This was the side of Miho's world she'd been shielded from, the reality that his protection was built on capabilities most people preferred not to think about. "We can discuss this reasonably," the man said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "No," Miho replied with terrifying calm. "We cannot. You approached someone under my protection with threats of violence. You entered a medical facility where an elderly woman was receiving care. You photographed a patient in her private room. These actions require responses that go beyond discussion." What happened next occurred with brutal efficiency that left Amara stunned by its speed and finality. Miho's security personnel moved simultaneously, their actions coordinated with the precision of a military operation. The confrontation was over almost before she fully processed that it had begun. When the silence returned to the parking garage, three men who had been threatening her life were no longer capable of threatening anyone. Miho approached her with the same careful concern he'd shown the night she collapsed at the gala, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft despite the violence that had just occurred at his command. Amara stared at him, processing the disconnect between the man who touched her face with such tenderness and the man who had just eliminated 3 threats with casual efficiency. "No," she whispered. "I'm not hurt." "Good," Miho said. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, guiding her away from the scene with protective authority. "This is why you live under my protection, Amara. This is why my security extends to everyone you care about. This is why independence is a luxury you can't afford in my world." As they entered the elevator, Amara felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or relief. She had witnessed Miho's true nature tonight, seen the deadly efficiency with which he protected what belonged to him. Instead of fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of rightness, of finally understanding the man who had rebuilt her life. When the elevator doors closed, sealing them away from the violence he had orchestrated for her safety, Amara turned to face him fully. The man who had just killed for her was studying her expression with an intensity that suggested her reaction mattered more than anything else in the world. "Thank you," she said simply. Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise or relief or satisfaction. "You're not afraid," he observed. "No," Amara replied, realizing the truth as she spoke it. "I'm not afraid. I'm grateful. I'm safe. And I'm yours." The words hung between them with weight that transformed the confined space into something charged with possibility. Miho's carefully maintained control cracked as he moved closer, his hands framing her face with reverent intensity. "Say that again," he said, his voice rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I'm yours," Amara repeated, her voice stronger now, more certain. "And you're mine, Miho, completely and permanently, and without reservation." The distance between them disappeared as he kissed her with desperate intensity, 3 months of careful restraint dissolving into overwhelming need. Amara responded with equal fervor, her body recognizing what her mind had finally accepted. This dangerous, protective, surprisingly tender man was exactly where she belonged. When they finally broke apart, Miho rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "Mine," he whispered against her lips. "You're mine, Amara. I protect what's mine, and I keep what's mine, and nothing will ever take you away from me." "Forever," she agreed, her hands tangling in his hair as she pulled him down for another kiss. Forever yours. As the elevator carried them home to the compound, where she had found safety and purpose and love, Amara realized that the threats tonight had accomplished exactly the opposite of their intended purpose. Instead of driving her away from Miho, they had driven her completely into his arms. Instead of making her fear his world, they had made her grateful for his protection. Instead of proving she didn't belong with him, they had proven that she belonged nowhere else. She was his now, officially and completely, and without any remaining reservations. And despite everything that declaration might mean for her future, she had never felt more certain about any decision in her life. Ready to continue to Chapter 6? Please let me know when you'd like me to proceed with Chapter 6, Forever Mine. 6 months after the parking garage incident, the organization that had threatened Amara no longer existed. Miho had moved with characteristic efficiency, dismantling their operations piece by piece until even their name had been erased from the criminal landscape they'd once tried to navigate. The elimination had been thorough, professional, and permanent, leaving no possibility of future retaliation against anyone under his protection. Amara learned these details not through dramatic confrontations or bloody aftermath, but through the gradual disappearance of security protocols that were no longer necessary. The armed guards around her mother's medical facility were quietly reassigned. The armored vehicles that had escorted her between appointments were replaced with standard luxury cars. The compound's heightened security measures returned to their normal, still substantial, levels. The threat had been neutralized so completely that it felt like it had never existed, which Amara had learned was exactly how Miho preferred to handle problems. Decisive action followed by seamless return to peaceful routine, as if violence was simply another business tool to be employed efficiently and then put away. This morning, however, felt different from their established routine. Miho had asked her to meet him in his private study, a room she'd rarely entered because it served as his command center for activities she preferred not to examine too closely. When she arrived, she found him standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the compound's gardens, his reflection multiplied in the glass like a series of identical, perfectly controlled men. He was wearing a different suit today, something in midnight blue that made his dark eyes appear even more intense. The cut was impossibly precise, the fabric clearly custom, but there was something almost ceremonial about his appearance that suggested this conversation would be more significant than their usual business discussions. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned across from his desk. The desk held a single item, a small velvet box that made Amara's breath catch before she'd fully processed what she was seeing. The box was positioned exactly in the center of the leather blotter, its presence somehow commanding despite its size. Everything else had been cleared away, leaving only that one object to focus her attention with unmistakable intent. "For the past 6 months, you've lived under my protection," Miho said. He moved to sit across from her, his posture formal despite the intimacy they'd developed. "You've fulfilled your obligations perfectly. Your work has exceeded my expectations. Your presence has transformed my life in ways I didn't anticipate when I made that original offer." Amara found herself holding her breath, sensing that this moment represented another turning point comparable to the night she'd signed those first papers. The difference was that this time, she wasn't desperate or afraid. This time, she was exactly where she wanted to be, with the man she'd chosen completely and without reservation. "I want to modify our arrangement," Miho continued. He reached for the velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that was stunning in its simplicity and obvious expense. The diamond was flawless, substantial without being ostentatious, set in platinum that caught the morning light with subtle brilliance. But more important than its beauty was what it represented: permanence, commitment, a future that extended far beyond contractual obligations. "I want you to be my wife, Amara, not just my protected asset. I want you to be the official partner of everything I've built, the acknowledged center of my world rather than someone I simply keep safe. I want your name on legal documents, your opinion in business decisions, your presence at my side not as an employee, but as an equal." The proposal was delivered with the same careful directness that marked all of Miho's important communications, but Amara could hear the emotion underneath his controlled words. This wasn't just about formalizing their relationship or ensuring her permanent security. This was about love, about a man who had learned to value connection over control, offering her the most complete commitment he was capable of making. What would change? She asked, though she already knew her answer. Everything and nothing, Miho replied. You would have legal authority over my legitimate businesses, access to resources that would allow you to build the art career you've always wanted, complete financial security that extends to your family permanently. But more than that, you would be acknowledged as the person I trust most, the one whose judgment matters more than anyone else's, the woman I choose to build a future with rather than simply protect. Amara studied his face, seeing past the careful composure to the man who had shared his deepest vulnerabilities with her, who had eliminated threats to keep her safe, who had somehow learned to balance deadly efficiency with unexpected tenderness. 6 months ago, she'd signed papers because she had no choice. Today, she was being offered everything because she was loved completely. The ring is beautiful, she said softly. The ring is a symbol, Miho replied. The reality is that you already own everything that matters to me. You already have my protection, my resources, my devotion. Marriage simply makes that official. Amara reached for the box, lifting the ring to examine its perfect craftsmanship. The weight felt substantial in her hand, solid and real and permanent. When she looked up, Miho was watching her with an expression of carefully controlled hope, as if her answer mattered more than anything else in the world. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Miho, I want to be your wife. The transformation in his expression was immediate and complete, controlled composure giving way to relief and joy and satisfaction, so intense it took her breath away. He moved around the desk to kneel beside her chair, taking the ring from her hands to slide it onto her finger with reverent care. The fit was perfect, as she'd known it would be. Everything about Miho's planning was perfect, from the size that suggested he'd been observing her jewelry for months to the style that complemented her taste without overwhelming her hand. This was a ring chosen by someone who paid attention to every detail that mattered to the person he loved. Mrs. Kong, Miho said, testing the sound of her new name. The smile that curved his lips was different from any expression she'd seen from him before, somehow both possessive and tender, satisfied and gentle. Mrs. Kong, Amara agreed, surprised by how right it sounded, how completely natural it felt to accept his name along with everything else he was offering. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the compound's gardens, surrounded by flowers that had been arranged to create a private paradise. The ceremony was small but elegant, with only essential witnesses and a minister who specialized in discretion. Amara's mother served as matron of honor, her health restored enough by Miho's medical team that she could walk down the aisle without assistance. The dress Miho had commissioned was a masterpiece of understated elegance, silk and lace that flattered her figure while maintaining the refined simplicity she preferred. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo that showcased diamond earrings that matched her engagement ring, gifts from her husband that would serve as permanent reminders of this day. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Miho's kiss was tender and possessive, a claiming that felt both familiar and newly significant. This was the man who had saved her life, protected her family, valued her mind, and somehow learned to love her completely despite the circumstances that had brought them together. The reception was held in the compound's main ballroom, a space that had been transformed into something magical through the efforts of planners who understood that this celebration marked more than just a marriage. This was the official beginning of a partnership that would reshape both of their futures, the moment when Amara stopped being someone under Miho's protection and became someone who shared his power. As they danced to music performed by a string quartet, Miho pulled her closer, his lips close to her ear. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "None," Amara replied honestly. "This is exactly where I want to be." 6 months later, Amara stood in the gallery space that had become her professional home, surrounded by artwork she had personally selected and acquired for Miho's expanding cultural empire. The opening reception for their newest exhibition was drawing art collectors and cultural enthusiasts from across the country, people who came specifically because Amara Kang's curation had developed a reputation for discovering exceptional talent. Her mother was there tonight, healthy and radiant, chatting with other guests about her daughter's success with obvious pride. The medical team Miho had assembled continued monitoring her condition, but the crisis that had once threatened her life was now a managed inconvenience rather than a constant fear. Miho appeared at Amara's side as she watched the reception unfold, his presence still capable of making her pulse quicken despite months of marriage and complete intimacy. He looked distinguished in his evening wear, every inch the successful businessman whose legitimate enterprises were thriving under their combined management. Successful evening, he observed, his arms sliding around her waist with casual possessiveness. Very successful, Amara agreed. The Korean contemporary collection is already drawing international attention. 3 museums have contacted us about potential collaborations. Miho's smile held satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. This gallery, this exhibition, this celebration of art and culture represented the life Amara had dreamed about before crisis had forced her into survival mode. Through his resources and her expertise, she had built something meaningful that extended far beyond their personal relationship. "Are you happy?" he asked, the question serious despite the celebration surrounding them. Amara turned in his arms to face him fully. This man who had transformed from dangerous stranger to protective savior to beloved husband. She thought about the young woman who had collapsed at a charity gala 8 months ago, desperate and exhausted and running out of options. That woman would never have imagined that her lowest moment would become the beginning of everything she'd ever wanted. "Completely happy," she said. "You saved my life, Miho. You gave me my mother's health, my career, my future. You gave me love I didn't know I was looking for. You gave me everything." Miho's expression softened with an emotion that still sometimes surprised her with its depth. His hand cupped her face with the same reverent touch he'd used the night he'd first kissed her, fingers tracing along her cheek, as if she were something precious and fragile. "You saved mine too," he said quietly. "You made me remember that power without purpose is meaningless, that protection without love is just control, that building an empire means nothing if there's no one worth sharing it with." As the reception continued around them, successful and elegant, and representing everything they'd built together, Miho leaned down to whisper against her lips the same word he'd spoken the night she collapsed in his arms. But this time, the word carried love instead of possession, promise instead of claiming, devotion instead of mere ownership. "Mine," he breathed, the word a caress rather than a declaration. "Forever yours," Amara whispered back, her response carrying equal certainty and infinitely more joy than it had held in that hospital elevator months ago. They were no longer stranger and rescued victim, employer and grateful employee, protector and protected asset. They were husband and wife, partners in both love and business, 2 people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to build a future neither could have imagined alone. As Miho kissed her in the gallery surrounded by art they had chosen together, guests they had invited together, and a life they had built together, Amara realized that sometimes the most terrifying decisions lead to the most perfect outcomes. Sometimes accepting help from a dangerous stranger becomes accepting love from the right man. Sometimes collapse becomes the first step toward everything worth having. She had walked into that charity gala 8 months ago with bruises and exhaustion and fear. Tonight, she stood in her own gallery as a successful curator, a cherished wife, and a woman whose future was secured by a love so complete it had transformed them both. The transformation was absolute, permanent, and more beautiful than any artwork she would ever display. From collapse to claiming to choosing, from desperation to devotion to dreams fulfilled, their story had reached its perfect, unshakable conclusion. Forever his, forever happy, forever exactly where she belonged.